Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, thanks very much for being here. You know, when we visited in my office and when you were here for your nominating hearing, I asked you for your opinion on the funding priorities in this reckless tax and spending bill. I expressed my concern about $80 billion in additional funding for the IRS. And specifically, we talked about the enforcement amount versus the amount for taxpayer services. You know, $45 billion for enforcement and only $3 billion for taxpayer services. So the ratio of $15 of enforcement for every $1 of services, you know, in the IRS strategic operating plan for the spending of all of this money, the first objective that you list is to dramatically improve services to help taxpayers meet their obligations and receive the tax incentives for which they're eligible. Yet the money ratio is 15-to-1 enforcement over providing for services. And this doesn't even include the additional $29 billion request for supplemental funding that you've come up with. So why would the IRS in its discretionary budget request, despite $45 billion in funding for enforcement, request, again, more money for enforcement, $5.9 billion, than it's requesting for taxpayer services, $3.4 billion?
Yeah, so I'm really appreciative of the question because I think it's really important to break down our budget in a way that makes sense and can be understood. So our base budget pays for our day-to-day operations, the volume of things that come in both from a services and an enforcement standpoint. And as I explained in my testimony, if you look at our base budget over the last 10 or 15 years, it has been on a steep decline, while the U.S. population and the tax laws and filers has all been much more complicated. So when COVID hit, everything kind of broke. And at that point, it was basically we couldn't do and continue to manage the way we would want, and services plummeted, and frankly, audit rates plummeted. And so what we need to do now is not think about the Inflation Reduction Act as let's use that to patch the holes in our base budget, because what the Inflation Reduction Act does is it spends for increased capacity so that we can improve operations. The difference, Senator, between just answering the calls versus having a callback option, having more digital channels, having more bots in the phone line so that people can get through quicker on things they can do in an automated way. So now to your question, look, there is room for us to increase our capacity in enforcement. The stats on this are pretty eye-opening. We only have today 2,600 staff that are responsible for assessing compliance with our highest wealth taxpayers, and there's more than 390,000 high wealth taxpayers. So to give you a ratio, that's one IRS person for every 150 high wealth taxpayer. And these filings are big and complicated. They can be thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages long. So look, if we started to move money out of enforcement into services, we would lose the ability to develop the capacity in that area, and that ratio would suffer. So the reality is we need to do both. It's our job and our role to make sure that the tax system is operating effectively, answering the calls, improving the calls, but also making sure people pay what they owe.
Because as we discussed, what I hear about in Wyoming are people that call the IRS, trying to get information, can't get somebody to answer the phone, all of those issues. So, you know, sticking to the issue of taxpayer service, when you look at the justification that you printed for this fiscal year budget, it says, quote, unless the IRS realizes sustained increases in discretionary funding, service quality is going to continue to suffer. I still don't know why the IRS is, in its plea for more money in its budget request, threatening to cut back taxpayer services instead of wanting more and more money for enforcement. So that's where I am on that. You know, the other issue is this long-awaited strategic plan for the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. It's well documented, very late, despite the extra time to pull together this highly anticipated plan. It's lacking in measurable targets. Basically, to summarize, the indicator said, we will do better. So the Wall Street Journal reported that your Deputy Treasury Secretary, Wally Odiamo, referred to the plan, and he says, we don't want to be locked into numbers on a piece of paper. I would just tell you, Mr. Werfel, every taxpayer in this country believes that they are locked into numbers on a piece of paper or they can go to jail. That is the difference. But if your assistant deputy secretary doesn't think you don't want to be locked into numbers on a piece of paper, I have taxpayers all around Wyoming who have very similar concerns. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.